This is a lecture on ecological disruptions for the unit on ecological communities taught in Biology 152, Introductory Biology 2, instructor Peter Houlihan, taught at UMass Amherst. Up to now we've talked about ecological communities from the standpoint of two species interacting. However, if you look at most ecological communities, there are lots and lots of species that are interacting with one another. So we can think of ecological communities as complex webs of ecological interactions among many species. Interactions among communities are often revealed in unexpected ways when ecological communities are disrupted. And by disrupted, I mean things like a hurricane that wipes out many species or drives populations back to lower levels. Disruptions can also occur through human activity, for instance, via cutting down forests, building roads, or even through climate change. We are going to look at three examples of how community dynamics are revealed by disruptions. First, we're going to look at how an apex predator, wolves, when removed from a system, cause changes in a system referred to as a trophic cascade. We'll then look at tropical deforestation and see that there's surprising outcomes in terms of how the system's disrupted, and we'll see that vertebrate diseases increase when you cut down trees. Lastly, we'll look at invasive species that have been introduced to an ecosystem that didn't previously exist in that ecosystem, and we'll see how that can lead to the loss of native biodiversity. Before we discuss the impacts of the loss of wolves in Yellowstone Park, we'll have to talk about several ecological principles that'll help you understand how the system changed. One of the ideas we need to talk about is how energy flows through ecological systems. All life is powered by energy. Where does that energy come from? How is it passed from one organism to the other? We can begin by talking about how energy is captured by primary producers. Primary producers are usually photosynthetic organisms. However, there are cases where there are chemotrophic organisms that use the bonds in chemicals and break them apart to capture energy. So for instance, we'll find these in deep sea vents where we find bacteria that live off of the chemicals that are released in those deep sea vents, and they make up the primary producers in those systems. We're going to work through this chart in which we look at how energy flows through two types of systems. On the left we have a terrestrial system, and on the right we have an aquatic marine system. And you'll see that in the terrestrial system, plants capture the sun's energy and use that to combine carbon dioxide and water to produce carbohydrates. The same thing occurs in marine systems by the activity of zooplankton, microscopic plants that are floating in the water. We refer to each of these levels trophic levels. This refers to energy. And the second trophic level is the primary consumers. Primary consumers eat primary producers. Some of the energy that's stored in the body of the primary producers can be then transferred to the bodies of the primary consumers. This transfer is not 100% efficient. Only about 10% of the energy that's stored in the bodies of the primary consumers is then turned into energy that can be used by the primary consumers. Here in this diagram, we can see that in the terrestrial system we have a grasshopper acting as the primary consumer, and in the marine system we have small microscopic organisms that consume the zooplankton. primary consumers can then in turn be consumed by secondary consumers. So in this case, in the terrestrial system, we have a mouse consuming the grasshopper, and in the aquatic system, we have small fish consuming the zooplankton, the floating microscopic primary consumers. At the next level, we have tertiary consumers consuming the secondary consumers. So in this case, we have a snake consuming the mouse and larger fish consuming the smaller fish. And this process can go on up to another level or two, but never beyond that. There's simply not enough energy to transfer up to levels beyond that. So in this case, we have a predatory bird consuming the snake and an orca consuming the larger fish. So again, we only have about 10 to 15% of the energy at a lower trophic level made available as storable energy to the level above. So this is going to limit the number of potential trophic levels. And it's also going to mean that animals living at higher trophic levels require more space to meet their energy requirements, because they're relying on all that energy that's been passed up from the lower levels up to higher and higher levels. Because of this movement of energy from lower levels to higher levels, traditionally ecologists believe that ecological communities were regulated, their structure was determined by organisms at lower levels of the energy pyramid. We call this bottom up. So in this case, the primary producers would regulate the populations of consumers above them. However, what we found is that that's not always the case. Sometimes we have top-down regulation, where the consumers actually regulate the populations of the producers. In some ecological systems, there's a combination of both bottom-up and top-down regulation. This can set up an interesting ecological phenomenon referred to as a trophic cascade. So here in this diagram, we have a very simple energy pyramid with primary producers at the bottom, herbivores at the middle, and predators at the top. The symbols in the parentheses refer to the type of regulation. So if it's negative, it means that it has a negative effect on the other. And as you'll see in this diagram, we can see that there's a negative effect of predators on herbivores and a negative effect of herbivores on primary consumers. So a very simple system. You'll notice, however, there's an interesting twist here. Predators can have a positive impact on primary consumers. And we're going to look at an example of this by looking at the wolves of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Wolves are considered an apex predator. They're at the top of the energy pyramid. And if you look at the history of wolves in Yellowstone, as a matter of fact, throughout the North American continent, it's a history of persecution. Wolves were both trapped and shot to near extinction in most of the United States. This had to do with attitudes towards them, that they were evil. It also had to do with issues of wolves preying on things that people wanted to eat, like deer and elk, and things that people were raising, like sheep and cattle. And as a result, they were extirpated from most of the U.S., including from Yellowstone ecosystem. However, in many places, wolves have returned, and this has given us an opportunity to compare ecosystems without wolves and then with wolves placed back in the ecosystem to see how this predator might have a top-down regulation on primary producers and on other species in the ecosystems. So it's a great example of a trophic cascade. Here's a map of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. In the center there, in yellow, you have the Yellowstone National Park, and then the green areas surrounding it are considered part of the ecosystem. And this ecosystem shares certain characteristics like climate, topography, and the types of plants and animals that you find there. Let's look at the history of wolves in Yellowstone National Park over the last 100 years or so. By the early 1900s, wolves were absent from most of the USA. They'd been extirpated through hunting, through trapping, through government programs that paid people bounties just to bring in the wolf pelts. In the early 1970s, the U.S. passed some landmark environmental legislation, the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act requires the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to identify species who are in imminent danger of going extinct. And once they're designated as endangered, a process begins to identify places where they could potentially either naturally or with human assistance recover. Yellowstone is designated as one of these recovery areas. And between 1995 and 1997, 41 wolves were transplanted from Canada and Montana into the park. Currently, there are about 400 to 450 wolves in greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Now keep in mind that wolves live in a pack structure and only the dominant male and female reproduce. So this is not as large a population as it may sound, since we've only have about 45 or so packs that are actually reproducing. This illustration shows the fluctuation of wolf populations in Yellowstone, beginning with the introduction up to 2012, and you can see it goes up and down, but it's been fairly steady, at least inside of the park boundaries, at around 60 or 70 wolves. This is a map of wolf pack territories in Yellowstone Park in 2012. You can see their territories are quite large. Because they're an apex species that is at the top of the energy pyramid. There's not much energy that makes it up to the top, so as a result they require large areas of land in order to satisfy their energy and nutritional requirements. Once wolves were reintroduced into the park, it had quite a lot of ecological consequences, and this diagram here shows you connections between wolves and their direct prey or directly on a competitor. So you can see coyotes and elk. And we're going to work through this and look at the direct consequences, and then we're going to see what the indirect consequences are through links to the direct consequences. And we're going to work through two branches. One branch is going to go through coyotes, and the other branch is going to go through elk. So to begin, you introduce wolves, the population starts to grow, the wolf population increases. Wolves have a fairly broad diet. They can feed on things as small as mice and voles and as large as things as elk and moose. In Yellowstone Park, during the winters, elk are their primary prey. Prior to reintroduction of the wolves, elk would spend most of their time down in the valleys, where it's easy to get around. There's lots of young trees to feed on and other vegetation. But however, when the wolves were reintroduced, there were two impacts on the elk. One was direct. Wolves fed on the elk. The other was to change the behavior of the elk. The elk no longer spent nearly as much time down in the valleys and started to spend more time up in the uplands, where it's more energetically costly to move around and where the quality of the food is lower. While the elk had free rein in the valleys, they overgrazed and overbrowsed the vegetation. In places where there had been trees when wolves were present before they were extirpated, trees disappeared, shrubs disappeared, shrubs and trees around the streams were also decimated. But once the elk started behaving differently and their numbers went down, the vegetation started to recover. So you introduce wolves and elk numbers go down. And elk numbers go down dramatically. As you can see in the graph, we went from a height of wolf populations of around 20,000 individuals down to about 4,000 or 5,000. You can imagine the pressure on the vegetation from 20,000 individuals. And this explains why much of the woody vegetation, trees and shrubs, had been removed from the river valleys. So the woody vegetation starts to recover. And this means now there's an increase in woody vegetation producing berries. Berries that are important food for lots of animals. As a result, bear populations start to rebound. Many populations of birds start to rebound. They can feed on berries, and all the woody vegetation provides habitat for insects that the birds can then use to feed their young. The beaver population starts to resound because beaver now have woody vegetation to feed on. Now beaver build dams and they change the course of flow of streams, and as a result the streams changed course. The geology of the area changed. So think about this. Wolves can control the shape of streams. Now with the increase in populations of all sorts of species that had been suppressed before, there's a lot more carrion around, and scavenger populations rebound. And among scavengers are bald eagles, and their populations also rebound after the introduction of wolves. Now let's move through the other trophic cascade where wolves from on top are controlling things that are at lower levels, at lower trophic levels. And we're going to do this by exploring the impact of wolves on coyote populations. When wolf populations increase, coyote populations go down. Coyotes are considered mesopredators, and this is a response we see all over the world. Larger predators suppressing populations of middle-sized predators. And wolves do this in two ways. One, by directly killing coyotes, and two, by simply harassing them. So coyotes have less access to food and are spending a lot more energy worrying about and avoiding wolves than they had before. Now, western coyotes are not very effective predators of deer, and it's almost impossible for them to take down an elk, and certainly they can't take down moose. However, they are able to prey on the smaller pronghorn antelope. And when coyote numbers go down, pronghorn antelope numbers go up. Coyote primarily prey on things like rabbits and mice and voles. So it's not surprising when coyote populations decrease that the number of these species increases. And this in turn provides prey for all sorts of birds of prey that like to feed on these small and medium-sized mammals.